My name is Carl Quo, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. Emily Greer has been on two founding journeys. The first one, Kongregate, lasted quite a while, and she was part of two acquisitions with it. The second, Double Loop, recently ended with the funding squeeze in the market. She was gracious enough to sit down with me for this episode to talk about both of these journeys, what they shared in common, and how and what she's learned from both. As a repeat founder myself, there was lots I empathized with in this conversation, and lots that I learned from as well. Let's jump in. This is a really fun experience to be able to talk to you because, one, I was a huge player on Kongregate way back when, but also having someone who can sort of look at two different founding journeys and talk about the two of them is going to be, I think, super interesting. So how I normally kick things off is asking about like that moment where you were like, yep, I'm going to start a game studio. And what sort of led into that moment. And for you, like both, what sort of led to that moment and deciding to do it for Kongregate initially. And then the other question that I always often think about is like, what level of insanity led you to say, yep, I'm going to do it again?
Yes. And that is a good framing for the second time around. So the first time it's a interesting story in that, it is just as much about my brother, who is my co-founder at Kongregate, as me, because Kongregate was his idea. And we've been sort of long-term, pretty close siblings, in part because we moved a lot. So I think that's a kind of thing that really bonds siblings when you're the only person who's had the same experience and you're like, in a foreign country, et cetera. So we've been close for a while, and we have a dynamic he's the older brother, I'm the younger one. And we had a long-term dynamic where he would get me to do stuff that I wouldn't otherwise do, and I would stop him from doing really stupid crap. And that is an excellent balancing function, I think, for both of us, and actually a pretty good co-founder dynamic. And what happened was he had a failed studio in the mid 90s called Titanic Entertainment. So, and their tagline was serving drinks till the ship sinks. And they actually owned the Titanic.com URL, URL, and then failed to sell it when they shut down. So, good decisions were made. So, and then he had been working at EA and was thinking of starting a new studio. And then as part of that, was thinking through the problems of game developers holding their rights, distribution, monetization, all of that. And YouTube was recently out. He had been working on a EA website called pogo.com that had a ton of community. And he sort of put those two ideas together, plus sort of independently developed games and the sort of burgeoning Flash games and browser games, and had the idea for Kongregate. And he was super excited about it and ready to quit EA immediately. And my now sister-in-law was like, hey, you can totally quit your job, but please talk to Emily first. And if she says it's a good idea, you can go ahead and quit your job. And I think this is in part because I was like the person in his life most likely to tell him, this is insanity, this is stupid, you shouldn't do it. And so he called me, I was on my way to work, and was like talking to him in a San Francisco Muni station at like 7:45, 8 in the morning, and he pitched it to me, and I was like, that sounds like a great idea. I don't see the downsides. I think you should do it. So I went into work. He went into work, and then EA escorted. He resigned, and then EA escorted him from the building by 10 a.m.
Wow.
Because it was something competitive. So it happened really fast. And then so he was starting it. And I was still working. I was in catalog e-commerce, and I was helping him with his business plan, because even though I didn't at that point know that much about games, I knew a lot more about business and marketing and financials. And I'd run in catalogs, I'd run like an 80 million P&L. So I was helping with him with that. And I was kind of miserable in my own job. And I had just come off this project where I'd been working, 80 hours a week, and had been told that we needed to move warehouses before Christmas and I was going to be in charge of it. And my boss had left, and I was just not wanting to do it. So it was a combination of, I really genuinely believed that Kongregate was a good idea. And I really didn't particularly want to be in the job that I was in. And I was helping him, and I was like, this is fun. He looks like he's having fun. What's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen, I had a realistic expectation. I was like, this will probably fail, and it'll probably fail in 1 year. And I have enough, savings, and I had just gotten, some options paid out from another company that I used to be at. I was like, there's never going to be a better time for me to take a risk. And the worst that happens is that I go back to what I've been doing in a year and I've had an adventure. So for me, like, my ability to manage risk is to think through what's the downside, what's the worst that could happen. I'm comfortable with the going without salary for X amount of time. I didn't really think through that potentially I could ruin my relationship with my brother, but that's good because I didn't. And I think that actually would have been the worst thing that could have happened. But
Hmm.
I thought it through in that period. And then, so this is about 3 weeks after Jim had been escorted from the building at EA. I asked him, I was like, do you want a co-founder? Because I think I would do it. And neither of us had a super clear idea of what I would do, but that basic dynamic of me being the sort of sensible one who's like good with financials, and I had like built websites and
Yeah.
other things that were relevant. We were like, we'll figure it out, and he said yes, and that's how I got there. It was I don't, I mean, and I think when I've made the boldest decisions in my life, and this is true of the second story too, it's always been because I've really gotten to the point where I am ready to walk away from whatever other things are, and I'm ready to like blow things up a little bit, and therefore this downside scariness is less scary because I'm ready for big change anyway. So um, in terms of the second, starting the second studio, that was, about sort of where I was with Kongregate at that time. So I had been running, Kongregate had been successful. We'd sold to GameStop 4 years in, and then GameStop had been a pretty good home and we'd grown a ton in that period. I took over as CEO. But then the beginning of the GameStop turning into a meme stock was that descent had started, and it was starting to have a pretty like negative impact on Kongregate. And with my boss at GameStop, we sold it into a company called MTG, which is a Swedish company that owns other game studios, and at other times, uh, at the time owned esports. And and then, once we sold that again, I was sort of committing to stay for another period. And a combination of just having been doing it for 13 years, and then some conflict between me uh, um, uh, and MTG. And I had gotten to that point again about 2 years later, so 13 years in total, where I was I really couldn't do it anymore. I had just absolutely fried myself. Uh, there's a lot of stress in running a startup, but there's a lot of stress at running a company that has 120 people, and you're doing M&A on a regular basis, and you're managing up within public companies. And I had reached my limit on that kind of stress where I didn't have agency. And I was really, really missing the early days of Kongregate, and the building of something. So that was part of it. And then I had been thinking a lot about sort of mobile games and sort of, and kind of women in games and sort of targeting and feeling like that there was opportunity there. And then I had a couple of friends who had started studios relatively recently, and it had the same thing as my brother starting Congregate, where I looked at that and I was like, that looks like so much more fun than what I'm doing. And then I got to a point where I was like, I'm ready to leave Congregate. And that was the first decision. I had to get over that sort of emotional thing, because to leave a company that you founded and have run for 13 years and all of the people in it was just like, it was kind of a devastating breakup, right? Like, it was like getting a divorce to some degree. Like, I was leaving a big part of my life behind. And so I had to make that decision first. And I had one of these sort of emotional, it was the week after GDC, and I went up, was on a little weekend away with a friend, and just kind of woke up one morning and knew I needed to do it. And then, when I was driving back from that weekend away, I started grappling with what do I want to do? And then it was completely crystal clear in my mind that I wanted to I had been in games for 13 years. I'd made a platform, I made a publisher, I'd never actually made games. I wanted to make games. I wanted to make games for me. I wanted to make games sort of for women broadly. I wanted to do a mobile studio. And I had like just 100% clarity and certainty that this was something, that was, I just had that feeling of mission again that I'd had at the start of Congregate. And I couldn't stop thinking about, I was like, I decided to give myself a cooling off period of like, I can't just like, I can't do it like my brother and just go in the next morning and give my notice. I had a board meeting, the about 10 days after I had made the decision, and I was like, I'm going to give it until then to make a final decision. But if I still want to do it, then I'll give my notice. And I could not stop thinking about it. I was, I bought, I came up with a name, wrote like the one pager of what the studio was going to be, and came up with a name and all of that. And I just couldn't stop thinking about it, was a sign to me like, yes, this is absolutely the right thing to do. Because I feel that level of energy and passion that you need to have if you're going to found something, that like, founding something because, it seems like a good career move. No, you do it because you can't do something else. And I was having that feeling. And so that was where I was at.
When you think about those two sort of jumping off points, and I think this is probably more relevant to your first time at the rodeo than the second.
Mm-hmm.
You talk to your brother, you're like, hey, do you want a co-founder? Like, I'm super in. And you even sort of mentioned like, not exactly sure what I'll do. I have a ton of relevant experience, but like, how do we balance this out and stuff? Like, we'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you were like, okay, I'm in, you quit your
Mm-hmm.
job, you're into this founding journey. What
Mm-hmm.
were the things that you're like, okay, I've jumped. Now I have to figure out X, Y, and Z if I'm actually going to do this. What were the big things that you're like, okay, now I have to go and learn this to be a
Mm-hmm.
co-founder of this business?
Yeah, and it was a little bit more gradual because I didn't want to leave the company I was at in the lurch. So I gave like, like 5 or 6 weeks notice, because the president of the company started to cry when I told him I was leaving, and I just felt so bad. So I think it was 5 or 6 weeks that I kept working there while helping Jim on the side, and then after that, I was consulting part time. So there was sort of a gradual transition on that for me. I mean, the first thing I did was like, I need to get a hold of the credit card and stop Jim from spending any money. And he was completely on board, and I was like, you know, like basically the first thing I did was like take control of the QuickBooks and start figuring out budgets and start figuring out the financials and okay, you know, taught myself QuickBooks. And then I was just playing games a ton, and playing the relevant games a ton. You know, I knew how to make websites, and I knew about that. So I was sort of trying to immerse myself much more on the game side and more different kinds of games than I'd been playing. I was a classic at that point. I was a classic casual gamer, so you know I had a lot of uh, you know, Bejeweled and Bookworm Adventures and PubCab games, and uh, played a lot on Pogo actually. So it was okay. I need to learn about other things. I think I signed up for industry newsletters, but mostly because I was still working. It was okay. I'm going to get hold of the financials and I'm going to ride shotgun on Jim, with Jim on whatever decisions he's making. And I'll learn from that, and play a lot of games. So, you know, terrible sacrifices I was making.
Yes. Yes. Oh no, the free time. I must commit the games. The part I really like to like dive in here, and in part, you know, sort of the idea of this podcast is to help folks who might be at that moment where they've either made the decision but they don't know exactly what they've made the decision to do, or they're thinking about like maybe I want to do this. Like
Mm-hmm.
what, you know, from your 2 points where you're like, okay, I'm going to go on this founder's journey. What would you go and I'm sure you've had this conversation because I'm sure folks have reached out to you and you've had conversations with lots of founders, but like, what is the thing that you would say like, okay, you think you've made this decision where you want to start a game studio? Here's my advice for how to think about the founding journey that's coming in front of you.
Mm-hmm. So when people come to talk to me, they're very often talking about, you know, investments and financing and other things. And the advice that I always give is to think about what kind of studio success uh, looks and feels right to you and your co-founders, because there is a range and a lot of what success can be, and it's important to understand emotionally both where you are and where your co-founders are, and that you're aligned. So and then that's aligned with how you proceed from there. So if you are wanting to make the biggest game in the world or one of the, you know, top 10 most played games in the world, um, then that's going to look like one particular thing. If your fantasy of um, is I would like to be like super giant and make acclaimed indie game uh, in after game until you have one that is like a broad popular success, and say a small studio, like a relatively small studio, and just make a bunch of money but without being, you know, the biggest thing on the planet. That's a very different picture of success, right? And the or you know, and those are both on the, you know, more of the core side, like PC console side. There's versions of this on mobile where it's, you know, are you Zach Gage, right? Like making, you know, like making a great living after creative game, or the, you know, Starlight, you know, Stardew Valley, you know, solo founder, or, you know, are you Supercell, or, you know, Scopely or whatever. These are all different kinds of successes. What kind in your heart do you want? And is the acclaim versus the money versus the control? How important are each of those three things to you? Because let's be honest, to some degree, all three of them are important, right? And the ideal is to get all three. But the more you go for, you want the biggest game in the world, your control, your agency, like that's going to get diluted and diluted and diluted and diluted. The more that you stay indie and agent, and have agency, then the money, like you're much less likely to make money. So these are all trade-offs. Understand what you want, and then if you are wanting agency less than money, then you should bootstrap. If you want the biggest thing in the world, then VC is the right path because your interests are aligned and you don't want to make choices early on that aren't aligned. And you don't want to end up in a situation with co-founders where you have different, like you may want to make the same game, but your idea of success is different because that's going to hit some rocks, some pretty gnarly rocks.
Yeah, for sure. So let's pivot a little bit to talk about co-founders because that's a good transition point. Obviously, for Kongregate, you sort of lucked out in that you had a co-founder that you've known for your entire life, and
Yes.
you knew exactly how you guys interacted and how you guys could make decisions and how you disagreed when you disagreed, right? Like lots of things along that path.
I would say yes, but there was being good siblings, good
Mm-hmm.
siblings as good friends, and building a company together are not the same thing. And that there was definitely things that I learned and also that changed in, I think it was about 7 years that we were running Congregate together, where I changed, he changed, our relationship changed, the company changed, and things were not consistent. I think, any long-term close relationship, I don't think if you talk to most people about their marriages, I don't think, it's exactly the same
For sure.
from, beginning to end for those same reasons. So I just want to give that caveat on the, the,
100%.
the sibling or friend or some other person that you know really well, that, yeah, the founding journey with them is different than your previous relationship.
Yeah, very much so. I think what I find interesting is like so often that, when folks are considering co-founders, especially if they're not like, okay, I have a group that I know I'm going to co-found with, it's about like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, how do I build even the baseline knowledge of this stuff going
Mm-hmm.
into a co-founder journey? But, having, for many folks, it's I've worked with this person for 5 or 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of siblings. Um, there were sort of two questions that I had though for the sort of
Yes, I
Kongregate
totally
journey.
derailed you. Sorry.
Oh no, it's all good. It's great context. One is, did you ever consider whether or not you needed another founder? Like, did you look at this and be like, hey, it's us two. Was a conscious decision of like, that is sufficient? Was there ever a moment where like, do we actually need another voice here or another skill set here? Uh, you know, was there anything in that decision or did you just kind of go with it?
No, there was multiple things. One is that just from an emotional perspective, I did want a co-founder. So the hardest period that I had in Congregate was the year after my brother left, because I didn't have that sort of partner in running the business. We had a plan, which is there's a we had a guy named Pani Haratatos, who is the VP of mobile, who'd come in as we were to run that as we were building our mobile publishing business, and essentially he was kind of my leadership replacement, right? Where I was taking over for a CEO from Jim, and he was sort of the replacement Emily to some to a large degree. But a few months after my brother left, Pani also had to leave for sort of personal family reasons. He had been commuting from San Diego and couldn't do it anymore. And so he had to leave. So suddenly I was alone running the company, and it was the single most successful year for Kongregate, where we went from, I think it was like 20 million in revenue to 80 million in revenue in like 1 year. And it wasn't quite that extreme, but it was in that kind of range. And we doubled in employees, and web was doing well, mobile was going crazy, and I had 13 direct reports, and it was like the most lonely and hard year. Like, all external measures we were doing great, and it was just brutal for me. And it was it took me so I started it took about 2 years, and then eventually Pani was able to come back. And that was the feeling of having Pani there, like either Jim or Pani there, was so different from the just brutal aloneness, especially in a larger organization where you need to be a little bit more distant from folks, just because you can't play favorites, and there's a lot of hard decisions to be made. And if things get to you, it's because they're shitty. And so I remembered that feeling. So from an emotional perspective, I wanted a co-founder. I didn't want to have that feeling that I was there alone. I also thought that, both with Jim and with Pani, we had really good dynamics of, Jim and Pani are not alike, but we balanced each other in terms of how we approach things, and we had really constructive arguments. And I wanted that. I thought that was just really healthy for the business. I thought it was healthy for me. And I also wanted somebody who would be the creative director, who could lead from a creative sense. I had business, publishing, fundraising, all of the business side, but I had not actually made games. And I wanted that's really important when you're building a studio, is to buying a studio is not the same thing as building a studio. I wanted that. So those were all things that I was looking for. I did the biggest debate that I also, for various reasons, was really hoping it would be another woman. And then the big debate for me internally was, did I want somebody from Kongregate, or did I want somebody else that I didn't know as well? And that was a hard decision. And I thought that it would be better to go with somebody external, because anybody from Kongregate was so used to me being the boss that I was worried that they would be too deferent and not argue with me and not tell me when I was wrong, right? Or not do it enough. And I thought I guess because I had gotten so much out of constructive conflict with my brother and with Pani, that was an important part of what I was looking for in another co-founder. So that's that was what I was thinking about.
Let's actually dive into that for a second, because I think that idea of constructive conflict is something that a lot of, when you read about co-founder dating and stuff, you read elements of this, of like, you should talk early with co-founders about how you're going to have disagreements, how you're going to make decisions, all these kind of things. But you were coming out of Kongregate, where you had these two really great folks that you worked with, that you had a really clear model of what constructive conflict meant for you. And so I was wondering if you could dive into what were the hallmarks of that relationship with your brother and the relationship with Pani, that, like, just unpack that idea of constructive conflict in a way that maybe other founders could be like, oh, okay, that's what it means. Let me go and understand how I might test that with my co-founders.
Yeah, and it was I feel like it's a little hard for me to encapsulate it in terms of I know it when I see it. I think that feeling of being completely free to be honest about what you think and be quite direct about it without it ever being emotional, right? And that on each side, both the other party feels comfortable saying what they think, um, and working to convince the other that they're wrong when they're wrong, or when they think they're wrong, and that the others, and having the trust that the other side will listen and really think about it, and go back and forth. So the I'm not saying that I never had sort of emotional moments, particularly with my brother. And I'd also say the way my brother and I fought is definitely on the basis of 30 years of practice arguing and resolving things. One of the big surprises when we first started Congregate was, I had, working with other people, I was so used to, working up to conflict where you're diplomatic and you're building up to, I don't agree with this, right, without sort of undermining them. And my brother and I would just go 0 to 60 of, you're totally wrong, you're being an idiot, no, da da da, like full on sibling fight. And usually, honestly, like we'd go 0 to 60, and about half the time, like within 5 minutes, we would come to some resolution. I'm not pretending like with Punny or anybody else I've ever had that. Like that is I've, we love each other in this deep way, and that you can go to that level. And I've heard since, from people around us that they found it quite a lot to be around. And that it took some getting used to. So I'm not sure that one is exactly the model, but I also was like, oh, this is really efficient, right? We're not spending a week having this argument. We're spending 5 to 15 minutes, sometimes with the ending of, I need to think about it, that comes back where you like think about it and then come back in an hour, come back in 24 hours, and it's resolved. And, in a startup, that efficiency is really important in terms of decision making. And while I would say Pani and I didn't have that sort of visible like rocket trail in the way in terms of how we argued. Um, we just would really enjoy talking to each other about what we were thinking about and what we saw was wrong, and never pretended that anything was okay that it would when it was not okay. And we're really sort of frank and honest with each other, and just were really interested in what the other person thought, and pushed each other on that perspective. So I would say with both Jim and Punny, we text about each other's business like still every week, right? Like that's the relationship where, they're about among the two first people that I text about anything that I'm thinking about. And I think, it's probably fairly similar for the other one too.
Shifting a little bit, normally I ask a bunch of questions about fundraising and how that went, but I actually want to take the opportunity with you to talk a little bit about, with Kongregate, in many ways, you had I don't want to say ideal outcome, but sort of like a golden path founder's journey, right? Like you started a studio, it hit at the right moment, and you had the M&A exit, and in fact you had two M&A exits where you sold the company again.
Yeah.
But like leading into that first M&A, and so like that first, I think you said it was like you got bought by GameStop after 4 years
Yeah.
of Kongregate.
Yeah. We started like May of 2006, and we sold to GameStop in July of 2010.
Yeah. So on that sort of first path and then leading into selling the business. I wonder if you could actually talk a little bit about sort of that journey, and specifically more the like we saw the success that we did, and then we considered, yes, this is the right time to sell.
Yeah. And I think some of the context is that it was a little less golden than it appears. So the initial ramp up was definitely pretty golden. There's no question about that. So, we started, May of 2006, and we had term sheets from, um, you know, uh, term sheets from Reid Hoffman for an angel round and multiple like convertible notes by the end of October. We had put, and basically what happened is that we'd been talking and talking and talking, and then we started a closed alpha, and TechCrunch wrote about it. And we got term sheet, like everything. Suddenly, it was like super competitive, and everybody was interested, and it happened quickly. And then we launched, and we in the spring, and while we had a lot of stability issues, we had extremely good traction with game developers from the closed alpha on, where we kept exceeding our expectations in terms of the games that we were getting, and we got traffic pretty quickly. So, our fundraising in 2007, and then we got a sort of bonus fundraise because Jeff Bezos called and wanted to invest in early 2008. And so, of course, we said yes. So through that period, I mean, it was really hard. Like it was, because we were having trouble keeping up with the growth, but it was very smooth until that point. But then we needed to monetize, and then that became a little bit more tricky. So we were getting ad revenue from the start, and we built that up. But ad revenue on a website was just, it was not a venture outcome, shall we say. And we had sort of believed that free to play was going to be there, was going to be the future of the business of games, which was early and prescient and correct, but we were a little too early. And when we launched in-app purchases on Kongregate, I think we got $300 a month for the first like 10 or 11 months. And then it started, so in sort of September of 2009, we sort of figured it out, and it started taking off, but still it was like, okay, it was 300, and then it was like 9,000, and then it was 27,000 in a month. Like it was ramping, but it wasn't amazing. And we also saw mobile coming. So, the iPhone had launched, and we were making money, but we had a team of 20, and we were getting short on the runway. And my brother and I had, gone down to minimum wage, and, some of our senior staff had cut down, and we got to break even, but it was very much a sort of nail bitey break even. And my brother had been trying to fundraise for mobile, and he was just getting absolutely nowhere, because we were no longer a rocket ship. Like we were a good business, but we weren't a great business. And so that was the context very much. And that's when GameStop came knocking. At that point, we were like, well, we don't really want to sell, but we'll have the conversation. And Jim and I had sort of a private conversation of what sort of the number was at which we would sell. And we were talking to GameStop for a pretty extended period, and they initially made an offer that was a very fair offer for the business that we were, but it was not fair for the business that we believed it could be. And we said no and walked away, and we thought it was dead. And then they came back. Like I went on the first vacation I'd been on in 2 years, and I got to Italy, and they suddenly reappeared with an offer that was exactly the number that Jim and I had said was the minimum that we would do it for. And so I spent my first vacation in 2 years having like 3 hours of phone calls at 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. every night to get it done. My my brother's second kid was due right around then too, so it was a fun time, and we never decided that we were going to do it. We just didn't say no, and both of us, because again, we were break even. It was, we could say no. So we were sort of going through the M&A, and we were talking to other people, and we did a little process. Google did a verbal offer that was more than GameStop, but they wanted us to shut down the business. Like we would have become like done the achievements platform for Google Play, and we were like, no, we it's not worth the money. So we said no to some other things, and we kept not saying no to GameStop. And then suddenly, you know, we're sitting in a lawyer's office with the papers in front of us, and it was like, okay, I guess it never fell apart. Um, and so we signed it and we sold. But it's the weird feeling of like, until the moment that we signed it, I never felt like I said yes. I just failed to say
Yeah, that's wild. Like, I mean, I think also I just had this vision as you were telling the story. I was just like, oh, so she lands in Italy, and then there's GameStop right there picking her up from the airport, saying like, hello, we have a new offer. Because of course that's the timing.
no. Yeah, my brother's second was born right in the middle of the like final due diligence. So he was like basically not available for most of it too. So it was like that last month in particular, it was like just me, and I nearly lost my mind.
So you've had two founding journeys that have sort of gone on their full sort of experience, like start
Yeah.
to finish.
Yep.
What was sort of like, when you look back on those two journeys, what were both sort of the hardest parts and also the biggest learnings? I imagine that those two things are likely tied together pretty tightly, but sort of just like, looking back on those two, where were you like, oh man, that these parts were super hard, and I would want to sort of like elevate that story for other founders thinking about their long-term journey, and then also what are the biggest learnings?
Yeah. So the two hardest parts were actually, I'd say it's a funny thing, where the hardest parts were when, the last year of shutting, with Double Loop, where we were, uh, you know, trying to fundraise, trying to pull it together in a really harsh environment, and really seeing the potential and having a good deal, but just hitting this complete wall of fundraising. So that was very stressful. And hard, and that's predictably stressful and hard, right? And nobody thinks, oh, the last 6 months before you shut down the company is going to be easy. So nobody's surprised by that. I think the thing that would be more surprising to people is how hard it was when we were successful. That the other extreme of the most stress that I was under was the first 9 months after Kongregate launched, when we were growing like crazy and not able to keep up with it. And then the second time again, when mobile was taking off and we were growing like crazy, and we were keeping up with it, but we were not keeping up with it organizationally. And that both the extremes of success and failure are very, very hard. And that, more moderate possibilities are actually like more, are easier, even if they're not even if they're not the fantasies. So, I'd say, uh, that the hardest moments with All of my co-founders were really painful, and that includes my brother. It did affect our relationship for a while. The last few months at Double Loop, Shelby and I were very hard on each other, and we both know that it wasn't it wasn't that it was as much the moment as anything. And we're doing fine now. And that core relationship, like being without it is terrible, but under stress, there's different kinds of stress, but that's can be the most painful part. I think the other thing to understand, and that was a surprise, is I'd run teams. I'd had responsibility for large amounts of revenue and part of a company before I started Kongregate. But there's just this completely different feeling when you're the founder that ultimately everything is your responsibility, right? In other people's companies, I could walk away at a certain point and be like, it's not my problem. And when you start a company, that's never really true. Like, you need to learn how to manage your emotions so that you let go of things, even in a case where, yes, you ultimately do have all of the responsibility. And that feeling of it's so hard to turn off, and learning how to turn it off and how to manage the sort of grinding stress and anxiety of that is really important. And that learning how to compartmentalize that those emotions and just the intensity of the stress of having payroll, of having people be dependent on you. When we sold the GameStop, I was the thing that I most enjoyed was I don't have to worry about payroll. I don't have to worry about payroll. And coming out of Double Loop, I've been taking time off and joined One Up, and I'm so excited. I was like, I don't have a team. I don't have payroll, and it is like the how many months do I have payroll for is just this like knife in your heart as a founder. And even when you've got runway, it's there. Like, it's a clock ticking, and different people take the responsibility in different ways. For me, like that feeling of personal responsibility for people's livelihoods, even though they're adults, even though they're making choices. It was just this weight on my shoulders there. I'd also say, when you're thinking about whether you should found and co-founders, etc., it's really important to think about, are you an anxious person? And how do you deal with anxiety? Because you're about to have so much dumped on you. And like that, I talked to somebody who I will not name, but who started a studio that's done pretty well with like 3 or 4 co-founders, and they said, I've lost my co-founders in the order of how anxious they were, right? That they moved on. And I think that's a thing to be prepared for, and to understand about yourself and understand about your co-founders, because it's just a different level that doesn't, even in success, doesn't go away. And you got to be prepared for it.
I have told many a prospective founder, I guess, person who has asked me about my founding journey and what did I learn and that stuff. I'm like, well, my first founding journey taught me that I needed anxiety meds. And I've been on them ever since, because that's how I decided to deal with my anxiety. You should figure out how you're going to deal with your anxiety, because you will have a lot of it.
I exercise a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. See, that's
make time for exercise, and make time for your friends and family. You got to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. I probably should do the exercise part more, but I went straight to meds.
Yeah.
So you mentioned you're on a very different path now, or I guess not very different, but you're on a different path now. You're with One Up, sort of on more of the investor side, more of the founder support side, which is awesome. I'm as someone who's invested by One Up, I'm super thankful to get to work with you and have you in our court for my own founding journey. So selfishly, I'm super glad for it. But, looking back, you've had two different founding journeys.
Hmm.
Would you go on a third? Is founding another company something that's on your mind or heart at all?
It's not, but I also wouldn't rule it out. Halfway through Congregate, if you'd asked me would I start something else, I would have said, "Oh, hell no, no, no! I did that once. I don't need to do it again." And then, no, I did it again. So I would never, even not feeling it right now, I would never say no, because when that idea comes and that thing that I feel like I have to do, I know how to do it. I know I can do it. I'll just, and I'll make that trade off with open eyes. The other thing I would say, having been a founder, especially now it was like 18 years, straight years as a founder, gets really hard to work for somebody else. And because you get used to that agency and that passion. Like, I can work for GameStop and MTG, but I was running a company I founded, and the I was running a company that I founded, and my exact degree of happiness in that situation depended on how much I felt like they were letting me run it. Uh, and so, as long as it still felt like my company, I was fine working for somebody else. And one of the things I sort of had to think about with in the last 9 months is, because I had, I talked to people about, either, joining good studios as an exec, or taking over companies. And I just couldn't, do it. I was not excited about it. And so I think, if I'm really honest, I think it's more like, well, I don't think I'll start another, company or game studio. I still think it's more likely than that I would just join another company as, as an exec. I think all of the, anything is possible when you get the right offer. You feel it and you know it. Right now, I don't think I'll do it, but I would never say never. And because, yeah, once you're a serial founder, you are a serial founder.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, amazing. Thank you so much for spending time with us and talking through your two founding journeys. Here at the end of the podcast, is there anyone you want to shout out? Any things you want to call out for yourself? And if anyone wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to follow up on this?
Yeah. So, in general, I'm at One Up. I really enjoy supporting other founders. I have conversations with lots of people. If you want to reach out, you can send me a message on LinkedIn. I read all of them. I'm not going to promise that I talk to absolutely every single person, but I do read and respond, and that's the best way to reach me. Just, it's a hard thing. It's a great thing. It's not for everybody. Happy to support. Shout out to all of my co-founders, Jim and Shelby and Punny, even if he's not officially a co-founder, but have that relationship. And all the people and investors who supported me on both of those journeys. So shout out, and plus the teams, Kongregate and Double Loop, and the lifelong friendships that have come out of some of those.
Amazing. Thank you so much for spending time with us. And I'm sure we will continue to talk as part of One Up.
Yeah.
And thanks for joining the pod.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano, music by Jake Hull, who's available for composer work in games. And if you're interested in learning more about the Game Founder support community, go to gamefounders.org or email me at carl@gamefounders.org. Thanks so much.